Okay, so what do we see here? Well, we have an overview of your digestive system and the different structures and organs and their arrangements and locations in the body. Now let's talk about the gastrointestinal tract, or simply called the GI tract. And it's also called the digestive tract, but and it's also called something else. It's also called the alimentary canal, and I tend not to use this. In fact, maybe when I see this, it's more in like academic journals, or I hear physiologists use this a lot. But in terms of people who are doctors, nurses, or in the clinic, you probably will hear the term GI tract thrown around all the time. For this class, I will say GI tract because it's easier to say and it's also less obscure. And you might be wondering, what's alimentary? Well, ¿qué es alimento en inglés? And that is like in Spanish. So if you know Spanish, that alimento is kind of like food or nutrition, something nourishment. So that's what it is. It's the nourishment. It's the food canal. You're just using the Latin term for it. Now, what is the alimentary canal? What is the GI tract? So the GI tract is a continuous structure, and it's basically a tube that runs all the way from your mouth throughout your body and then eventually ends up at your anus. Now, what we have here is the alimentary canal, and in order, you start at the mouth, and then the next structure is the pharynx, then you go to the esophagus, then you go to the stomach, then you go to the small intestines, next is the large intestines, and then it ends up at the rectum, and finally exit whatever's undigested ends up in being expelled from your anus. Now let's zoom in on the alimentary canal. Now what this figure is showing you that there are multiple layers that make up the alimentary canal. And not all organs will look like this, but these four layers, the four main layers of the alimentary canal, they are continuous with each other. So what we have, or what are the layers? So here we have what we call the inside of a tube is the lumen. So the layer closest to the lumen, the innermost layer, is what we call the mucosa. And this is where it can get a little confusing. There's something called submucosa. So when you think sub, you think something's below, but it's actually like, yeah, just below the mucosa, we have the submucosa. So even though it just means that from the lumen, it's further away from the lumen than the mucosa. Then you have the muscularis externa. Sometimes you might just hear it referred to as the muscular layer, but that's where the muscle, that smooth muscle that lines the GI tract is. And then you have an outer layer called the serosa or adventitia, depending on which part, or not just which organ, but also which part of which organ you're at in the GI tract. So I'm putting a little asterisk here. So serosa is sometimes known as adventitia, and it's adventitia in certain structures. So the GI tract actually runs in and out of what we call the peritoneum. So peritoneum is a sheet, a membrane that lines your abdominal cavity, and depending whether it's in front and toward your anterior or whether it's toward the back of your body. So if it's retroperitoneal, it's called adventitia, and if it's bit in front, then it's called a serosa. So, but just know that serosa and adventitia, if it's there, it's the outermost layer compared to the lumen. Okay, now let's zoom in here. And what are the digestive accessory organs? Well, one of them are the teeth, and actually this guy doesn't have teeth, so let's add teeth. Yeah, so now he has teeth, and these are what example, the digestive organs, accessory organs. And then we also have our tongue, and we have our salivary glands over here. We have our liver, our gallbladder, and our pancreas. So these are the accessory organs of digestion. Now, common misconception, you might think, oh, it's accessory, so it's like something that's peripheral, it's not really needed. So accessory digestive organs, they are not, the accessory in this case does not mean unimportant. They do serve critical functions in digestion. So if you're missing them or have something wrong or something affecting their function, like, or some sort of disease affecting your digestive organs, or if you have them removed, that can severely impact your quality of life, especially if you have something's wrong with your liver or pancreas. So they're called accessory more for not so much in function, but in terms of their anatomy. The GI tract, that's what we talked about, that initial tube that runs from mouth to anus. Now, these accessory organs, they are connected to the GI tract, but they're not stops along the way. So they're kind of like side streets compared to the main street. If the GI tract is the main street, the accessory digestive organs and all the ducts that lead to them are more like on-ramps to the main street. Now, the teeth and tongue here over here in the oral cavity, this helps to provide mechanical digestion, and then salivary glands in the oral cavity and the liver, gallbladder, and pancreatic secretions. These help with chemical digestion. And if you're, so, I mean, if say you're missing your teeth, or if you have like an elderly loved one, you might know they might not have like all their teeth, and you can see like how that limits what they're actually able to eat. Or if someone has something wrong with control of their tongue or a lack of a tongue, that can affect their swallowing as well. Or if they have something wrong with their liver or pancreas, that also can affect the amount of or how much nutrients they can digest, because those secretions are very important in actually breaking down everything that is or digested food that's leaving the stomach. So there's actually an organ missing from this picture, and the previous picture is of the GI tract, and that organ is the mesentery. Now, maybe in around when was this? 2017, there was like this story like, oh, a new organ discovered by scientists and medical doctors, and pretty much everyone in anatomy was like, we knew about that, but it's not new to everyone who deals with anatomy. But why is it important, and why was it a landmark study? Because it shows that even though the mesentery, and look at this structure, it's kind of like a little spiral right here. It has a complex shape, but does have regions, and it does have its own anatomy. So previously, some people thought that the mesentery was just connective tissue or just sheets of membrane, and it's just something you can cut. But then they found out, hey, it actually has structure, some consistencies in its structure, and it actually has a function. So these are the mesenteries, and what we're seeing here is the large intestines and the sheet that seems to be wrapping or attached to this part of the intestines right here. These are the mesenteries, and what they help to do, well, one major function is to attach and help organize and keep these in the intestines in shape and keep them from forming knots in your body. But, so we know the mesenteries are there. What business does it have there? Well, if you look here, now let's rewind a bit and talk about this layer that's surrounding and actually like lining the inside of our abdominal cavity. And it's actually attached to forming all these like folds that weave in and wrap around these organs of our digestive system. So this sheet is actually called the peritoneum, which is a type of membrane, a serous membrane that lines the cavity. But as you notice that it's also visceral because it actually lines our organs as well. So what the mesenteries are these, notice that at certain points that there's not necessarily wrapped around the organ, but there's these double layers of peritoneum. So that's the basic structure, and that's why these mesenteries look like thin sheets, or I shouldn't say thin, but they look like sheets of tissue because they are sheets of these membranes, just a double layer. Now, are they just there as connective tissue? Well, they actually form an important function of structural support. So you can see that these mesenteries are anchored eventually to the walls of our abdomen. So they also provide structural support that help to keep the inside of your abdomen and all the organs in there from weaving in and out of each other. So it would prevent, like, say, this segment of the intestines from weaving in and out because it's held in place by mesentery. So GI organs, but not just GI organs, but also blood vessels. So this is also where the mesenteries are also important in transporting fluids to and from your GI tract. So what fluids? Well, definitely, so you'll have scaffolds for things like arteries and veins, but we'll also have like scaffolds for lymphatic vessels as well, because again, you need lymph to return excess fluids that due to hydrostatic pressure. And what else? Well, they're still researching this part, but what now they know is the mesenteries aren't just membranes that do nothing and just hold things together. Now they're seeing like, hey, this is actually a little organ that And this has implications for things like surgery. Are you going to cut these mesenteries, or are you going to leave them intact? Or what if you have to cut these mesenteries? Will that affect your quality of life and recovery? That's still being investigated. So that's why it was like a big hoopla, at least in when they put out those press releases. But now it's a more exciting area of research. Now, when we look at the GI tracts inside, what do we see? If we look at the very inside of the GI tract, the innermost layer, that lumen, then we'll notice that there's a thin sheet of cells that line the insides of your GI tract. So, a little review. So, when you have an epithelium, that's one of the basic four types of tissue. So, epithelium is some sort of layer of cells that covers either an inner or outer body surface. Now, along your entire GI tract, epithelia fall into either one or two categories for the most part. So most non-secretory epithelia, meaning that they don't produce some sort of secretion onto the inner surfaces of your GI tract. So the non-secretory ones, the ones that don't produce secretions, these tend to be stratified squamous. And epithelia that secrete something, the secretory epithelia, these tend to be simple columnar. Now, why do the non-secretory epithelia tend to be stratified squamous? Well, let's talk about abrasion. So basically with abrasion, something surface is rubbing up against other and kind of like scraping alongside it. So you can have abrasions on the outside of your body. You can also have abrasions on the inside of your body. So cells can scrape off and slough off and be detached from any exposed surface of your body. So your skin, if you say you're like biking or skateboarding and then you fall and then you end up like getting road rash, that's going to scrape a bunch of cells off your body. Or even if you like bump into something or even your own clothes, they're sloughing off small tiny amounts of cells as you have a surface rubbing your external surfaces of your skin. But it's not just outer surfaces, but also as food passes through your mouth and throughout your GI tract, that food is able to actually slough off some cells as it travels through. Like say, a practical example, if you ever had like a panini or like a very crunchy toast or something like a Reuben sandwich, if you had something that's very dry and to chew it, you might notice that the inside of your mouth feels kind of raw after. And why is that? Well, that very dry or hard substance was scraping off cells from the inside of your oral cavity. So that's also why it's important to have multiple layers, that stratified squamous layer in your mouth. So what I'm getting at here is that food, as it travels through your GI tract, it can scrape off some cells, and this is why it's important to have additional layers that help to protect against that. But the thing is that once you get rid of a lot of dehydrate the food and it gets over here, it starts becoming more solid. So as it becomes more solid, it becomes harder, and then this harder substances and surfaces, they can also scrape off more cells. So this is why they tend to have it there. Now for a little review on epithelial cells. So when we're talking about a simple layer of epithelial cells, we're talking about just one layer. And there are three basic classic types or shapes of epithelial cells. So we have squamous, and squamous cells, if you measure their width compared to how tall they are from their base to what we call the apex, so the apical side is facing the inside or whatever the exposed surface is. So let's compare the width to the height. So if we have with a squamous cell, notice that they're really flat. So they're going to have a longer width compared to a shorter height. Now with a cuboidal, well, if you back to geometry, a cube has equal lengths on all sides. So a cuboidal cell, well, it's not going to be shaped like a cube, like a dice per se, but when it's saying cuboidal, it's having a width that's roughly approximately equal to the height. So they have like, it's very similar in width and height compared to being squashed flat like a squamous cell. Now with a columnar cell, well, the column is a tall structure, right? So a tall structure, but is it going to be very wide? So a columnar cell, instead of being flat, is going to be taller than it is wide. And that's the general difference between these three simple shapes of epithelial cells. Now, what do we mean with stratified squamous? Well, a simple layer of cells is going to just have one layer of cells, and that's it. There's not going to be multiple layers. If there's two or more, then it's going to be a stratified layer. So strata means layers and layers, or actually strata means layers. So with the stratified squamous, or actually stratified any epithelial, it's going to have multiple layers of cells. So it's not just one layer that's attached to a base right down here. So with the alimentary canal, remember that cells can scrape off of any surface in your body, both external and internal. But we're talking about the GI tract, so we're talking about internal. Now, with this is the first point that food enters your body. So it can be hard, it can be rough, it can be something that's going to scrape off cells. So this is why it's important to have stratified squamous cells, because these are small cells that can be sloughed off, but you can also regenerate multiple layers. If you had only one layer of cells, once you get rid of that layer, what's going to regenerate it? So with stratified squamous, one of the great things is that you can have multiple layers that regenerate over and over. If you lose the top layer, don't worry, you can generate more strata, you can generate more layers of cells. So the mouth, pharynx, and esophagus have stratified squamous epithelia. Now the anus also has stratified squamous epithelia, and why is that? Well, the thing is that when food, it does mix with liquids and becomes more liquid when it enters your stomach and travels through your intestines. But as it starts, the small intestines absorb most of the water from your digestive food, and then your large intestines are going to squeeze out remaining water until it becomes more solid. So as it becomes more solid, it's going to be harder and potentially scrape off more cells. So when it's well, hopefully it's not super dry because that would be painful. But when it's drier and more solid, what happens is that it's going to scrape along the insides of your GI tract more. So this is why it's important to have a lot of layers of cells and additional protection toward the end where you're expelling a solid, or assuming you don't have diarrhea, that you're expelling solid waste. So it makes sense to have stratified squamous epithelia at both the entrance and exit. Why? Because again, things can be solid coming in and exiting here. So you want these layers to have this extra protection. And if you lose a layer due to these cells being scraped off, you want this basal layer over here that can regenerate more layers so that whenever the next meal or the next bathroom time comes, you have more cells to protect and for the underlying layers from being scraped off and harmed by whatever solid substances passing into your system or out of your system. Now, what about the rest of the GI tract? Well, here we have the stomach, small intestines, and large intestines. So compared to the mouth and compared to the anus, these are pretty far away from the entrance and exit of the GI tract. So these are going to have simple columnar epithelia. So when they're down past here in the esophagus, or actually when the digestive food mixes with the stomach, it starts becoming more liquid. So we're less concerned with the contents of our food scraping the inside. But now we're going to secrete all these enzymes and chemicals and molecules that help to chemically digest our food. So now that we're in this part where it's more inner and it's very liquidy and not very solid, now we can start secreting a bunch of stuff. And if you remember my histology lecture, that when you have a large cell volume, you can also pack more proteins and enzymes, and basically you can have more, it's like a bigger factory. And if you have a bigger factory inside your cell, you can generate more enzymes and more secretion. So it makes sense to have a simple columnar epithelium. Now, among the simple columnar epithelia, you also have the cells like goblet cells and other cells that produce mucus. So it's not just about enzyme, but also producing things that help to protect and your GI tract from digesting itself with all the enzymes and chemicals that are contained within your GI tract. So yeah, basically, where do you find the simple columnar epithelium? You find them at the places that are most central in the middle of your GI tract compared toward the entrance or the exit of your GI tract. And our learning goals and key points for here is that, okay, you now know the organs of the GI tract, and you're also able to explain the difference between a GI tract organ and an accessory digestive organ. Again, accessory does not mean unimportant. And you're also not only able to know the organs of the GI tract, now you should know the order of the organs as it goes from the start to the exit, so entrance to exit of the GI tract. And also about the different layers of the GI tract. So again, we've going from the inside lumen and working your way to the outside. And serosa and adventitia, again, maybe more advanced A&P classes will be more sticklers on that, but you should definitely know it's definitely the outermost layer. Then categorize the epithelial arrangement of the GI tract. So what is the inner lining like? And luckily, it's not, even though it changes from organ to organ, it either falls into one category or the other, stratified or simple columnar. And we briefly talked about the mesentery. Now, I don't expect you to know it completely in depth, but I want you to know that it's there, and it does serve a purpose, especially in organization. Its anatomy is complex. I don't expect you to know all the subregions of the mesenteries, but it's more about appreciating, okay, the mesenteries are there, and the pictures of the digestive tract. It doesn't have the mesenteries image, but it doesn't mean that they're not important. They do serve purposes in supplying fluids to and from the digestive tract, but also organizing the organs of the digestive tract within your abdominal cavity.